Scotland has voted, and Scots have decided by a margin of 55% to 45% to stay part of the United Kingdom. With me to discuss the implications are Lionel Barber, editor of the Financial Times, and Chris Giles, the FT's economics editor. Lionel, if I could start with you, the margin seemed a little bigger than polls had predicted. Why do you think that was?
A lot of the older people came out to vote. The weather was good. It was really a victory for the silent majority. We've heard a lot and seen a lot about the energetic Yes campaign led by First Minister Alex Salmond, but actually in the background there were people, older, more mature people, who recognised there were real risks in voting for independence.
David Cameron's already spoken this morning, talking about a new constitutional settlement for the UK. How do you think that will look?
We don't know. There is an element of, shall I say, constitution making on the hoof here, because as we know, after that very surprising and alarming, from Downing Street's point of view, poll showing that the Yes was for the first time in the lead about 10 days before the actual poll, then all parties led by Mr Cameron threw it effectively the kitchen sink at the Scots and said, we're going to offer new devolved powers. And today we got a glimpse of that, but also something else very, very important. Mr Cameron saying, of course, if we devolve powers in terms of fiscal responsibility, benefits and other things, then those powers need to be shared and mirrored elsewhere in the United Kingdom, including in England.
Chris, I'd like to bring you in here. We had a relief rally already this morning in markets, sterling rising on the result. What do you think this means for the UK economy and the economic recovery?
I think the economic recovery, we're back to square one. We're back to where we thought we were. We've had a 2-week panic where people put investment on hold on the basis that there might be a great dislocation in the UK economy, and we're back to where we were now.
Right, thanks Chris. And Lionel, these new powers that the Prime Minister was talking about for Scotland, how easy do you think it'll be to get agreement at Westminster on them?
I think it'll be quite difficult because, if you like, the silent voice up until now has been, what do the English MPs think? There's been a long simmering problem about Scottish MPs voting on English legislation. Mr Cameron wants to address that particular problem, known as the West Lothian question. But the issue is, what other matters will have to be addressed? Dealing with tax, and as I said, social security, welfare benefits, and we don't really know. All we know is that Mr Cameron has called for a balanced solution. That leaves a lot of wiggle room.
And Chris, do you think that wiggle room will include space for the Scots to run more of their own economy?
It will, but there's some really, really important details. Just to think about what the sort of principles of them are. If the Scots get more powers over their own tax system, does this mean that if the Scots economy does very well, they keep the money? Or does that go into the UK pot? If it does badly, for no fault of their own, do they lose money? And if they get this sort of power, the people behind us in London, they'll want that sort of power as well, for exactly the same reasons that we haven't heard the English speaking. So exactly, they're getting some of these powers, but these really important details haven't been ironed out yet, even in the powers they're already going to get under the 2012 Scotland Act. And so as we look forward and they're going to get more powers, these sort of really important ways of moving from a very centralised system to a more federal type of government, these are questions that any sort of government has, but we're still really at square one. So the idea that we're going to have them settled by March, I think, is living in cloud cuckoo land.
Well, we heard from Alex Salmond, the First Minister, this morning, pressing hard for those new powers. Lionel, what do you think this result means for him?
At the moment, it looks like he's staying. It was interesting in his reasonably gracious concession speech that he said the question of independence was settled at this stage. At this stage, Scots had not voted for independence. So he'd clearly like to leave the door open to having another vote. From here, from today, from the perspective of the result, it doesn't look like it's close enough to warrant any kind of referendum or lack of clarity for another, say, I don't know, 10, 15 years or whatever. The other point, of course, is if the Scottish economy doesn't do so well in the future, and if oil revenues begin to tail off, then maybe some of the momentum behind the Yes campaign and the push for independence will dissipate.
So you think, Chris, that that's right on the Scottish economy, that perhaps we've seen the high watermark here of Scottish enthusiasm for independence with the oil revenues running out?
Well, the easy argument, it's Scottish oil, is going to get more difficult. Scotland's oil, or the UK's oil, as it actually is at the moment, has been a declining resource. And unless the oil price goes very, very much higher, or the amount of money spent extracting that oil declines, both things looking reasonably unlikely. The forecasts are that it's going to be declining in future, in which case, because Scotland spends more money or gets more public expenditure per head, they will not be able to say, if we were alone, if we were independent, we could have less austerity, better public finances, an oil fund, and all the sort of things that the Scottish nationalists have been advocating to date. So if things get worse, that sort of simple argument really gets much harder to play.
Thanks, Chris. And Lionel, a quick final word from you. What do you think this result means for David Cameron and for Ed Miliband going into the general election in May next year?
For Ed Miliband, in the immediate perspective of today, he doesn't look so good because he was certainly eclipsed by Gordon Brown in that extraordinary, passionate speech in defence of the Union, by far the best speech of the political campaign. With Mr Cameron, he lives a little like the Union. He lives for another day. He left it late. It wasn't in the end a close-run thing like at Waterloo, but Mr Cameron perhaps did not negotiate the best possible terms of the referendum question in his dealings with Mr Salmon, although for him, he's got a decisive result.
Okay, thank you, Lionel, and thank you, Chris. And to follow the Financial Times' coverage on Scotland, all the analysis, commentary and news, please go to ft.com/Scotland.